We're on the phone today with Daniel DeVazay. He's got a new book out called The King of the Blues, The Rise and Reign of B.B. King. Hey, Daniel, how's it going today?
Pretty good. And yourself?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, no, thank you.
Well, I know you've got a new book out, King of the Blues, The Rise and Reign of B.B. King. Can you tell the listeners a bit about the new book?
Yeah, I kind of set out to explain to myself and to anyone who wanted to read along why this man matters so much, why he's so very important in the history, not just of the blues, but in all of popular music. I grew up listening to all these guitar solos, people like Clapton and Santana and Billy Gibbons. And I also, I'm from Chicago, so I'd seen, Buddy Guy and Otis Rush and Son Seals, the great black blues guitarists of the 60s and 70s. And I always wanted to know kind of where this came from. And I thought I knew that B.B. King was the originator of that kind of classic guitar sound. And that's what the book is about. It's a journey of connecting the dots back to B.B. King, who in 1950, basically, creates this sound. It's a solo electric guitar sound that replicates sort of the human voice. That's Lucille. Lucille sings when B.B. stops singing. And it's like a Charlie McCarthy, Edgar Bergen sort of thing, but it was B.B.'s original idea. That's his genius. And that became, slowly over many years, that became the pervasive sound in kind of solo guitar in pop music.
Yeah, and I think there were a lot of blues guitarists who maybe, as you mentioned, had a kind of a similar backstory as B.B., but he really was able to transcend all that and really became not only the guy that people think of when they think of blues guitarists, but really kind of part of Americana as well.
When you look back on his career now, he reached ever higher sort of tiers of fame and celebrity over many decades. Even by the 1970s, once he'd crossed over to sort of universal celebrity, the State Department was already sending him to Africa, sending him to the USSR as an ambassador, not just of music, but of sort of American culture. And by the time he receives the sort of Presidential Medal of Freedom from President Bush, I think that was in '08, he'd reached this level of a Louis Armstrong or a Miles Davis. I mean, he was probably a nicer guy than Miles Davis, but, similar levels of genius. Now he seems like this towering giant in American culture, but he spent many, many, many years toiling in, I would say, relative obscurity. If you asked a white person who was a fan of, pop music in the early 60s, they might have known the name B.B. King, but they wouldn't have been familiar with his music.
Well, Daniel, can you talk to us a bit about how you put this book together? I mean, it looks like you've interviewed just about every important player in the life of B.B. King. Were you able to speak with him himself, or did you meet him at all before he passed?
No, I started this project a couple of years after he died. I didn't have the good fortune ever of meeting him. I'd seen him perform, but who I interviewed was all of the surviving musicians who'd played with him. I spoke to people who'd played with him in the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. I got to most of the surviving musicians who were in his band over the years, those who were at least in good enough health to speak to me. I interviewed people in Nashville and Memphis, in Indianola, all over Mississippi, and then by phone a whole bunch of other places. And, there's no one in his inner circle who's still alive who I didn't eventually speak to, and I'm very, very grateful because none of them knew who I was. I mean, once I'd interviewed a few people and they understood that I was passionate about this project, they started telling each other, "Hey, this guy's okay. You can talk to him."
Excellent. Again, Daniel DeVazay is with us. We're talking about his new book, King of the Blues: The Rise and Reign of B.B. King. And, he really has two parts of his career. I know you mentioned this in the book. A lot of people know the latter half of his career, I think, with The Thrill Is Gone and, what that evolved into. But, really the first half of his career, I think, revolutionized the way, not just blues guitarists, but, all guitarists really approach the instrument.
Well, I didn't know any of this, but in the first decade that B.B. King was recording, and during which time he was a very, very, very popular rhythm and blues performer in the segregated black music community, he was mostly celebrated as a singer. It's very interesting. You won't really find clippings from the 1950s talking about his guitar at all. And this shows partly what a great singer he was, but it also shows just how different people heard different things in his music. He was the whole package, and people who went to hear him play, of course, they knew that he was a great guitar guy, but what he was really written about for was his singing. And then around the end of the 50s, and this is 10 years in, right, 10 years into his career, these black electric blues guitarists, including Albert King and Buddy Guy, rise up and start sort of developing the B.B. King guitar sound. They heard his guitar, and that was what they were interested in. And so they start spreading sort of the gospel of B.B. King's sound, and they spread it over to Britain, where it falls on very receptive ears in the form of like Clapton, Jimmy Page, Dave Gilmour, those guys. They start playing that way, and then they bring it back over to the United States. It's very confusing, but it crisscrosses the Atlantic Ocean. And then by the close of the 1960s, the sound, which I will argue this is B.B. King's sound, has sort of suffused popular music in America. By the Woodstock era, there's no self-respecting band in the States or in Britain that doesn't have a guitarist who plays like B.B. King.
And one thing I loved about him that you didn't see with a lot of other guitarists, of course, he would pop up on TV all the time. I know, like Married with Children, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I think his appearance on Sanford & Son, probably one of my all-time favorites. It's interesting he kind of became like a character after that.
Yeah, well, so he breaks through to sort of, universal celebrity, which I mean white and black, in the United States around 1967 with a huge historic performance at the Fillmore, Bill Graham's Fillmore, the sort of hippie palace. After that, he goes on Carson, he goes on Ed Sullivan, he tours with the Stones. He continues to play to his historic audience of passionate black fans, but he builds a new audience of white fans, and of course it's probably a larger audience. And over the course of the 70s and the 80s, he has sort of handlers. Sid Seidenberg, his great manager, who sort of put him in films. He scores a John Landis film at one point. He goes on, Sanford and Son. He makes all these appearances and does commercials. If you're of a certain age, you'll remember him pitching like I think Burger King, and I think he might have done like Greyhound or Amtrak pitches at one point. And just like Andy Griffith, another person I wrote a book about, B.B. King became such a big name that you could put him on any medium and he'd sell.
Excellent. Well, again, King of the Blues, The Rise and Reign of B.B. King is out, and obviously a great book for B.B. King fans, but also really about, music around that time and, how record companies kind of treated the black blues artists, and a lot of great stuff in the book. And I know it's just out, Daniel, but is there anything else maybe you're working on that we should be looking out for?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you. I'm happy to say this is one of the best reviewed books of the fall season. It's certainly my best reviewed book, and I'm very grateful for that because it's such an important subject. But if you're in Minnesota, right?
Yep.
My last book was about Greg LeMond, who's one of the great Minnesotans. He lived there for 30 years. Was the first American to win the Tour de France. And I'm happy to say my book about Greg LeMond got him the Congressional Gold Medal, which is kind of equivalent to the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So of interest certainly to people in the Twin Cities area. But yeah, B.B. King is my current gig, and I'm so proud of it. I think it's it's the first cradle to grave biography of the great man. And yes, I hope people will embrace it as a gift idea for that person who's hard to buy for, who went to see B.B. King 5 or 6 times.
Excellent. Well, definitely I'm excited for the book and maybe what's coming up next. Hopefully I can speak with you again sometime.
I would love that.
All right. Thank you so much, Daniel. I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
And again, that was Daniel DeVazay, and his new book, King of the Blues, The Rise and Reign of B.B. King, is available now.